Hello everybody, sorry that's my fault, I didn't unmute my microphone. I'm Hugh Fielding and I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar being conducted in partnership between the Australian Council of Adult Literacy and 2610, which I'm sure everybody knows about both those organisations. A few technicalities before I introduce Dave. We'll have question and answer time later on, and if you have any questions as the session goes on, just look for them, keep them, and there'll be polls coming up. If you see a little queue down the bottom, you can respond to those where you can add a question. Dave, as you all know, is a very experienced numeracy educator and recognised throughout Australia for his skills and knowledge. And we're very lucky to be able to have him this year for the Year of Literacy for Numeracy for Literacy Practitioners, Year of Numeracy for Literacy Practitioners. If there's anything you need during the session, just type into the chat box down the bottom and we'll see if we can keep this all together. So without any further ado, I'd like you to hand you over to Dave Tout.
Thank you, Hugh. Okay, so welcome everybody, and hope you can hear me clearly enough. It's again a delight to be able to talk to people about my favourite topic, my passion, which is teaching numeracy. And really the idea of this session was to do a little bit of a reflection on what we did earlier in the year and see if there's people can share their experiences about what they might have tried. So what we'll do today is start with a bit of introductions. I've got a few questions and get a bit of feedback from you. And then I'll spend a little bit of time, I guess, reflecting on what I saw as some of the key messages coming out from the workshops I did at the start of the year. And then really what I hope will happen is that some of you will be prepared to share some of your experiences, either by writing in some comments in the chat box down on the bottom left-hand side, or even saying via the chat box that you're happy to have a chat, and what we'll do is get you to Anna, who's working in the background to make all of this work. We'll get in touch with you about how you might be able to actually speak to the rest of the group and share your experiences. So hopefully when we get to the end where I've got a few questions for you to think about, if you've got something to say, then please, would be fantastic if you would contribute those ideas to the group. So the first question I had is, whereabouts are you from around Tassie? So if you can respond to the poll that is on the screen, let's have a look at where we're picking you all up from. Quite a few from Launceston, Devonport, Hobart, southern area. I'm not quite sure how many we've got now, but yep. So most people have responded. Okay, so nobody from Central Midlands. All right, so a good spread from really I guess the three areas that I did the PD in, which was, you know, Hobart, Launceston, then up to Burnie. So we're sort of got a good representation from each of those groups, which is good to see. And then I want to know how many of you actually did attend one of my workshops. Have we got anybody who was either lucky or not lucky, depending on how you view it, to come to one of my workshops at the start of the year? So we've got a couple of people who weren't, 3 people now who didn't come to one of my workshops at the start of the year. For those people who don't know, there's another series of workshops, a second round, coming up in September. I'm sure Hugh might be able to talk about that at the end, about the date. I think it's the second week in September, I think we've got planned, first or second. And again, I'll be in Hobart, Launceston, and then up in Burnie again. And really the second session is for you to do a little bit more hands-on work yourself in terms of developing ideas and resources and training materials and activities and so on. So it'll be a little bit more of planning activities and how you might do it yourself. So again, I probably found this out when I was working with you earlier in the year, but can you tell me what you see as your main function in adult L1? And do you see yourself mainly as a literacy person, an ESL person, a numeracy person, are you a coordinator, researcher, or whatever? So it looks like we've got mainly literacy or coordinators, managers at this point in time. Anybody who's going to put their hand up as fundamentally a numeracy teacher tutor? Doesn't look like it. So we've got a mix of people who are coordinators, managers, and literacy teacher tutors, and hopefully some of those coordinators and managers are, also either a literacy or a numeracy people as well. And as Megan just said, she's both numeracy and literacy, which is good to see. So again, probably not an uncommon blend of people. So the next question was, how much do you feel you actually know about the teaching and learning of adult numeracy? Do you think you know a lot, a bit, or not much at all? I hope if you went to my workshops at the start of the year, maybe you'll at least say a bit. And, yep, so that's good. Maybe some of the people who say not much at all didn't come to my workshops at the start of the year, and hopefully you'll still be able to get into the second round. And I guess the other question, which is a follow-up to that, is then, how much have you actually taught numeracy? And I guess for some people it would be interesting to know, and maybe when we have a conversation later, whether that's changed this year after you went to the workshops at the start of the year. So a pretty even spread between a bit and not much at all. So nobody saying a lot. Much at all is a bit ahead of the others. Good. So I guess that shows to me that numeracy is still something that isn't being addressed a lot, that people are still feeling fairly inexperienced about, and the whole purpose really of this series of workshops this year was to really to make numeracy more of a focus and to drum up a little bit more interest in numeracy, but also hopefully to give people some practical skills whereby they can actually incorporate numeracy into whatever the teaching is that they're doing. And I guess what I wanted to start with was, to reflect a little bit about, why this initiative this year by 2610 to make numeracy a focus. And generally, I've had a lot of demand this year to travel around Australia to do a lot more PD than usual in numeracy. I don't think there's many states that I haven't been to already this year where I haven't been invited to or actually been to this year where I've actually been asked to run some PD sessions about teaching numeracy. And so it's interesting that there's been quite a big change, I think, in the last year or two, and I'm just wondering why that's actually happening. Why is there this interest? And certainly the sort of the opening when we opened the year of numeracy in Hobart, the first talk that I did at launch was really about lots of the stats and data that came out of those international surveys called the acronyms, ALS and PIAC, but the latest one was the Program International Assessment of Adult Competencies that I worked on. And basically those international surveys show that there's a significant number of adults, which includes people from as young as 15 up to 74, do have significant problems in both literacy and in numeracy, but that my reading of that data is that I think the problem in numeracy is much more significant than the problem in literacy. And if you look at both the international assessments of adults, but also the assessments of kids in school, the 15-year-old assessment of around the world that's called PISA, that if you actually look at our relative performance in numeracy or mathematics compared to literacy/reading, is that we don't actually do anywhere near as well in numeracy and mathematics as we do in literacy. So it seems to me we actually have a challenge in terms of trying to actually address the numeracy issue, or a bigger challenge. But I think our practices are that we often focus in on literacy, and numeracy doesn't get as much of as much recognition and as much time dedicated to teaching numeracy. And I guess the second dot point there, again, if people came to my sessions, I sort of presented a bit of research that I think is now coming out that also says that numeracy actually can be a more powerful indicator of people's success, both in an economic sense and in a social sense. That is, if you have really low numeracy skills compared to literacy skills, that the impact of having low numeracy skills can be stronger than low literacy skills, both from an economic advantage but also from a social disadvantage perspective. I guess the other thing that I'm wondering whether what's been happening is because government has now mandated people having to do pre-training assessments, so whether we really want to do it or not, and I think there's a whole range of reasons why it is sensible, but that governments have mandated that, you know, as part of the our delivery of any training package units, that we really need to do an assessment of both literacy and numeracy. And I wonder whether that's another reason why people are now saying, oh, my goodness, I need to know something more about numeracy. The other thing that's happened this year is I've been invited to talk to ESL, the ACAL teachers who are teaching within the AMEP program on using CESWI, that numeracy has also been made, you know, more, you know, almost a core unit, subjects that have to be taught. So there's also a request from people to know about how you teach numeracy/mathematics to ESL students as well. I mean, I think the other thing to me is that maths and numeracy can be fun. It's a bit of variation, and that I think there's lots of reasons why we should be doing some numeracy and maths. And if people didn't, when I was down for the launch of the year, I actually had to get up early and was interviewed on ABC Radio in Hobart, and I think that link's still available on ABC Radio. And it was interesting because one of the concerns was that publicity might be about the fact, and this has happened in Tasmania before, about how hopeless Tasmanians are, and 50% of our adults are illiterate or innumerate, and that's not what the surveys are saying at all. And the discussion that we had on the radio, I think, was a constructive discussion rather than something that's very negative, which is often what the media can take on board. So the next thing to me, I mean, again, people who came to the workshop saw this cartoon about getting the decimal point in the wrong place. And I mean, it seems to me as a maths teacher, a maths educator, that what's really important is that knowing mathematics, knowing where the decimal point goes is really important, and it can have consequences. And I think if there's any message that I talk about is that I think that it's the fact that if you don't have good math skills, then there can be problems both in your life at work, if you're building bridges or building anything or working in any industry, but also in terms of people's personal lives or their lives at home or out in the community, that actually having some math skills is really important. And I know it's sad, but that, you know, us maths people go around supermarkets and taking photographs of odd things in mathematics. And I'm not sure whether this has happened. Hugh might be able to talk about it later, but I know I was talking to Jen about having a little competition, and there was maybe going to be a competition going around Tasmania about could you take photos of some interesting, you know, misuses, if you like, or abuses of mathematics. So the interesting thing about that little, you know, the price code that sits on the supermarket shelves, which when they were introduced, I thought the whole idea was to make it easier to make a decision about whether this was cheaper to buy this tin of tomatoes or that, or whether it was cheaper to buy this, what I love are toilet rolls, because the price is usually number of cents per 100 sheets or something rather. So it's interesting to compare, and of course I assumed that this would be standardised, that as you went from one supermarket to another or from one product to another, that the unit prices would be the same. But if you actually, I'll see if I can highlight it, but if you actually look at the price code just above where I've got the red dot, in fact this dishwashing powder is about 5 times as worth. It's 5 times more valuable than the same amount of gold. So this dishwashing powder that I was able to buy from my supermarket was something like $7,386 per kilogram, and the price of gold is just is something like 1,500 or something other dollars per kilogram. So I should have stored this packet of dishwashing powder and tried to resell it and make a lot of money. So it's interesting that I think that when you often are looking at how people use mathematics, it's quite, unfortunately, quite common that sometimes people don't get the decimal point in the right place, and that's what happened here. It should have actually been $7.38 per kilogram, but obviously somebody got the decimal point in the wrong place, or was using grams and not kilograms when they were doing the unit price. But we do make assumptions that people who are doing these things in practice in the workplace, in this case in the supermarket, actually know how to do the mathematics. I guess the other thing that I thought was a key message in what we were talking about was the fact that, there's a lot of our students, when we get them in adult education, have been through many, many years of schooling, sometimes 13 years, and we're thinking, my goodness, they still don't know how to add up, subtract, multiply, and divide, or do some calculations with money. And I think the important message to me about this cartoon is that what we often end up doing in teaching adults, whether that be for literacy or numeracy or English as a second language, is that what we're teaching them is the understanding of why we do why we do what we do, and that often what's happened in schools is that kids are sat there and they've been sort of taught in that traditional way where the expectation is that you'll just do what the teacher does and you'll learn by rote, and there's no understanding that goes on. And I think one of our crucial roles as adult educators often is to actually go back and teach why we do things. And there is always a rationale for why we do something, and to build on the knowledge and the skills that the learner is coming into our classes with, and through that to engage them in learning maths successfully. There's a couple of slides here again. People often say to me, and they're often math teachers, but other people too will say, well, but there's no maths in our lives, we never use maths. And even when people sometimes go into workplaces and they go and observe what people are doing, they'll actually try and tell you that people aren't actually doing or using any mathematics. And I just think that's nonsense. And so here are just a few things that, sport is a really good example that's full of mathematics. Cars, buying cars, running cars, full of mathematics. Anything about drink driving is full of mathematics. Supermarket brochures are often a common thing that we use, and that's an obvious place where we use mathematics and money. And the internet now, we're all buying things off the internet. That little image on the bottom right-hand screen is about downloading music, where you can now actually, not buy a whole CD of music. You can decide what songs you want and how much they are. So there's actually mathematics in a hell of a lot of things. Driving, getting around the world is a hell of a lot of mathematics. And of course, medicine is to me a really, really crucial area where if you don't understand about how to read dosage on medicine, then there are severe consequences. And there's usually, whenever I go anywhere, somebody has a story about somebody who's been impacted on the fact that people haven't been able to understand or give the correct medication. And please, I know Kerry was just saying that she couldn't hear, and that might have been me getting a bit slack with where I had the phone, so I'll try and be careful, Kerry. But if people have got any questions or comments as I'm going through, please type them into the chat so I can see it as we go. And Hugh, I'm sure, is keeping an eye on it and can also let me know if there's any general sort of comments coming in that we can answer. The next screen, I guess, was about, which often is, to me, when people say, well, what is numeracy teaching about? And I think often people sort of focus in on that, the second one, if you like, there, the fact, and it's related to the question Hugh just put in, is that often people see numeracy and mathematics as being the same thing, and that, when they think of solving a numeracy problem or teaching numeracy, they think of just teaching math. So that is teaching about how to multiply, how to do some calculations, maybe how to do some conversions from one metric unit to another, how to work out change and things like that. And I guess one of the key things to me is that I think there's a big difference between what mathematics is and what numeracy is. And to me, numeracy is about the use and application of mathematics for a purpose. And when you actually look at what people do in terms of their lives and using mathematics, it isn't, you don't, a math sum doesn't ever appear, in front of you. Basically, mathematics will appear within some context in our lives or at work. It's usually only in math classrooms where you actually get a sum that says 20 over 100 multiplied by 225 over 1, cancel it down and work out the answer. So to me, when I talk about numeracy teaching, I always argue that there's two other really important aspects of teaching numeracy, and that is one aspect of literacy, which is about how you actually decide what the math is that you have to do. So you have to understand the text, the stimulus, the context that you're working in. You might have to read something. You might have to listen to somebody telling you what to do. You observe something happening. You're doing something at work. You're playing a sport. You're doing whatever, but something will appear where you might need to do some mathematics. And so understanding what the mathematics is, to me, is a literacy activity. That is, you have to be able to decide on what the math is that you're going to do. You've got to extract the mathematics out of the context. And then you can go on to the second aspect that I've talked about, which is doing the mathematics. And that's when you might end up actually doing what I often call sums, where you're actually practicing how to do those skills. And of course, as a teacher, you will be teaching how to do some of those skills, which is taken out of the context in order to actually make sure that we have the skills and knowledge in order to do the mathematics. And then the other thing that I spent a bit of time talking about last time, and I'll actually spend more time at the next workshop, is talking about the role of language, because it seems to me what I found with all the adult students that I taught over many years is that it's actually the terminology, the conventions, the language, probably what we really call the discourse of the world of mathematics, that is a challenge to a lot of people. And this is where, in fact, they don't engage with mathematics because they don't either understand the language or they get confused by the language that we use in the mathematics classroom. And if people remember from the workshops who attended that we did a little bit of activities, and I'll come back to that in a little while. And so what I've got on this slide, on the next couple of slides, is some examples of, I guess, maths in a context and what I see as the literacy aspect. So this is from an example of one of the workplaces I did some work in, which was a small goods producer in Victoria. And this is the standard operating procedure, or only one small part of the standard operating procedure for making, in this case, roast beef. And you can see within that document that there's a lot of mathematics. There's the 12 hours, there's the temperature, lots of temperatures in there, there's time. You've got to record all of this data onto a spreadsheet. You can see that there's dates, that there's the number of slices, there's the weight, and we've got the 7 again. So if you keep going down, you'll see that embedded within this operating procedure, even if somebody's telling you what to do, that there's a hell of a lot of mathematics involved. And there's division because there's supposed to be 7 slices and the net weight is supposed to be this. So therefore, there is a lot of mathematics embedded within that, but they're not by themselves, they're within a set of instructions. So if you don't actually have the literacy skills to understand the instructions, then you can't get to the mathematics and you can't decide what to do. So it seems to me that it's important that when we're working with students, we're also working with them about how to get the mathematics out of the context and how to make the decision about what the math is that they've actually got to do in that situation. I mean, a really obvious one, and if I go back and reflect on all the teaching that I did, the most common thing I probably ever used in a classroom was supermarket brochures, especially with my low-level students, because they were accessible, they were common, and the other thing is that it tries to minimise the amount of reading. So what we often do in numeracy is try and find a stimulus, if you like a supermarket brochure where the mathematics is a bit more obvious, so that we can get the mathematics out without having to do too much reading. But to me, the real world still is full of those standard operating procedures, like for making the roast beef, where in fact that's an important skill. But often what we do is we bridge that by making the literacy demands less and trying to sort of address the mathematics still in a context, but in quite an explicit way. One of the project that I've been working on recently, I've finished and available now, where the roast beef example, but another example that we got to work on in this project was working with a kitchen cabinet maker. And this is the illustration of what happened when the worker went out to the home to work with the homeowner to design a new kitchen. And this is the sketch, one of the sketches that he took back to the office. But you can imagine in terms of producing that sketch, there was a lot of talking going on with the homeowner about what was required. There was a lot of measuring. There's words on the diagram. And then what happens is, of course, they go back to the office and they have to draw an accurate plan. So there's a lot of language going on and talking that's going on between, first of all, the customer and the person who goes out to the house to do the sketches and get the information. And then that person, the worker who goes from the house back to the person who's going to do the design. It could be the same person. It's most likely to be the CAD person at the office who will then convert that into an accurate diagram. So again, a lot of literacy, a lot of talking going on, and probably reading as well. Again, this is something that I'm not sure whether I shared the last time I was down, but this is an example from a different industry that I worked in, which was asphalting. And you can see that there's 4 steps in this set of calculations that these people had to do when they were doing asphalting. This is when they're driving the truck of bitumen down the road and the bitumen gets sprayed out at the back from sprayers. And in order, I always thought before I went to this industry and had a look, is that they just hop in the car and drive it down the road, and then they put the aggregate over it, and then they put the steamroller over that. But in fact, before they hop in the truck to drive it down the road, this is only 4 steps, and there's probably 8 or 9 steps that they actually have to undertake to get there. So you can see here that the literacy demands of understanding those steps are probably at ACSF level 4 minimum, in order to understand even the literacy in the words that are being used. So, and then in this case, the mathematics is quite complicated as well, because what you'll see is that basically each of these steps has what we call as a mathematics formula. So each of those lines that I'm highlighting now are in fact all what we traditionally call a formula in mathematics. It's just that it's not written as a formula, because what often happens, I find, in the workplace is that people want to avoid school-based maths, so they won't simplify it and put it into a formula. And to me, as a maths person, that makes it harder, because the literacy skills that are required to understand this and understand what to do is even more complicated, I think, than if it was written in shorthand, that is, using a formula. But there is this barrier. People don't want to go back to school-based mathematics. They want to try and avoid school-based maths, and they often want to therefore avoid using a formula. So I guess all I'm trying to say in these few slides is that the literacy demands, the reading demands, the listening demands, the speaking demands of doing a numeracy task, which is maths in a context, is equally as important as actually being able to do the mathematics. Again, people who were there will remember us working through this problem. And so I want to talk here about doing the maths. So I'm saying that there's 3 aspects to teaching numeracy. One is the literacy side, and the second message I was trying to give is that you still have to know the mathematics. And what we did in this example that I took from asphalting was that there was the need to calculate 20% of whatever this thing here that I've just highlighted called the compacted thickness. You had to measure that, which in this case was 225, and then you had to add on 20%. So you had to do a calculation of, 20% of 225. So you had to do that calculation. And it, when we did it there on the spot, everybody probably worked out 20% of 225 in a whole range of ways. So, for example, people often know that 20% is a fifth, so we divide the 225 by 5. A lot of people say, well, 20% is double 10%, 10% is easy, just move the decimal point, divide by 10, and then double it to get you 20%. Or some people who are a bit more mathematically inclined would say, well, I've got to add 20% onto the original amount, which is the same as multiplying by 1.2, so they might do that even in their head on a bit of paper. And of course, the other common thing is use your calculator. But the interesting thing that in the training materials for doing this Cert 3, Cert 4 unit was that the only way that they actually taught in that classroom for training these mainly young men in doing asphalting was to do it as in the traditional maths way. And I think to me what's really important is that sure, we may need to do that if they don't understand percentages, but what's crucial to me in mathematics is that we actually look at different ways of understanding and doing the mathematics, and we build on what students know and go forward from there. So what I would always say is I would ask in the classroom, well, how do you work out 20%, Dave? How do you work out 20%, Hugh? How do you work out 20%, Anna? And then we'll all probably come up with different ways of doing it, and then everybody can say, oh, that's a good way. And we actually learn from each other about what's the best way and the most efficient way and the most familiar way for us to do the mathematics, if you like. It doesn't have to be about 20%, it can be about anything. So let's learn from each other, let's look at different ways of doing it, let's support each other to do quickly, efficiently, either in our heads or a bit of paper. I think the other thing to me is maths was often seen as really boring, and again, people who came to workshop and played lots of games, so let's have some fun. And let's play different games, and some of those games can be quite educational. So I think that's one of the things I also try and say is that teaching the mathematics can be fun, and we can do that by playing games. And then remember the third aspect was about understanding the language that we use in mathematics. And remember I have a few activities and a few anecdotes about words like volume and odd and negative, and then awful words like quotient, which is a word that we really only use in the mathematics world. And often the words that we only use in the mathematics world are really difficult to read again and to spell and to understand. So that literacy aspect comes in as well, if you like, that the words and understanding what the words mean in order to get the maths out is quite difficult. Thank goodness we often don't have to use quotient in the real world. For those people who weren't there last time, there's an anecdote, which is, it's actually true. It actually came out of some research in the UK about kids in school having to do this, in a longitudinal study, had to do this calculation of using that good old formula V equals L times W times H when you work out the volume of a box or a rectangular prism. And you had to multiply, the length by the width times the height and get the answer for the volume. And this kid got it wrong, and the interviewer then asked him, well, do you know what volume means? And the kid said, oh yeah, that's easy. And the interviewer said, well, what is it? And the kid said, oh, it's the knob on the TV set. And so here's this kid sitting looking at a diagram in a math textbook or a math test, thinking, what the hell's this got to do with the volume of the TV or the volume of my radio? And we don't often think about, I think, that connection about how we use the words in a math classroom versus how we use them in a math sense. And if you don't understand what the word means in the math sense, then why would you understand what it is you're doing and what the operation is? So to me, I guess, again, I've learned a lot from working with adult students, but I think it's this misunderstanding and the challenge of the words that we use is something that really I've become passionate about, and that I think is a real key to people successfully learning and engaging with and understanding mathematics. And for the second round of workshops, I'll actually be demonstrating some other ways of addressing this issue of language, and I think it just fits in with what we do as practicing literacy and ESL teachers, is that we actually can do this stuff as part of our normal teaching without even naming it as numeracy. But in fact, we would be addressing it. So I think the language and the words that we use are really important. So what was I suggesting we could do about it? I just think being aware of it. So if you're going to use doing some calculations with volume or area or perimeter or something like that, then talk about the words before you get on to doing the actual mathematics or doing the calculations or going out into the outside the classroom to do some measurement. Let's have a discussion about the words that we're using. And this day with the internet, it's fantastic that you know, we can actually get students to go and find out this themselves. We don't have to always be the gospel of all knowledge, that we can actually say to students, well, why don't you go and find out where else do we use the word negative? And so I think there's different ways then of getting students to work in small groups. If you get students to work in small groups, then they have to talk to each other, get them to understand what the problem is, then talk together about solving the problem, and talk together about doing the mathematics. So therefore, what they'll naturally do is help each other. And often we know as teachers that, you know, often your best evidence that somebody knows something is you hear them explaining it to somebody else. And then again, we can use some of the practices that we use already in literacy in the ESL. Let's keep word lists. Let's play some different word games. Play things like crosswords, close activities. You can do what we do in literacy, but just with a focus on mathematics. And there's these things called cooperative logics, which are just, I think, gobsmacking, and that's what I'll share with you when I come down to Tassie next time. And yeah, like Hugh's just said, I used to have primary school maths dictionaries, and I have had sets of those in my classroom, and we just used that, and then we kept a glossary as well of the sorts of words that we were going to use. So it seems to me that it's really valuable, and also a way of engaging people who haven't liked mathematics is to make it more sort of a literacy and language activity. But in fact, what you're doing is you're sort of explaining how the world of mathematics works. So I think this is nearly my last slide before hopefully I'll get some questions coming from you and volunteers to talk about what you've been doing. So, you know, if I think about some of my key messages about how I think you teach numeracy, I think the obvious thing which we do in adult learning, it's an adult learning principle, is that you actually use relevant and engaging context that your learners are interested in or need to learn. It might be because they're actually going into some particular vocational area that therefore you need to teach the mathematics relevant to where they're going, whether that be into becoming, you know, builder or a carpenter or a car mechanic or a hairdresser or whatever. There will be the mathematics related to that, and hopefully if they've decided to go down that pathway, then they will want to know the mathematics related to that. But if not, something that's out there in the community that's interesting and fun. And what, for example, this is the second of this series of webinars, and there's another one next week, but last week we had a colleague and numeracy person called Anne who talked about what she started to do, which was to basically sort of find something interesting in the news that had some maths in it, and use that as almost a conversation starter. And she just said it was amazing how much students got involved in themselves finding out things that were on the news, in the newspaper, in their community that actually had some mathematics, and bringing it back into the classroom and using that as the starting point to actually have a discussion and to do some mathematics related to whatever that context one was. So I thought that was really, I think she called it numeracy in the news or something like that. So there's quite simple things that we can do. The other thing to me was, let's make it hands-on. So often our memories of mathematics in schools was sitting there with a worksheet and just doing sums. And I think the more we can make it practical and hands-on, using real materials, doing actual projects and investigations, the better. I think we know from other research that using varying our teaching practices and approaches and using cooperative learning methods by us working with the learner, not sitting there by yourself and doing it in isolation. And then I think the other thing that I keep talking about is the language, and I think also I think that the issue of having fun is something that breaks down some of the barriers and negative attitudes that our learners can come with when you say, oh, we're going to do some maths or we're going to do some numeracy. They might have fairly negative attitudes about it. You'll see the picture on the bottom right with the row of people. Again, people who came to our workshop, we did an activity where we looked at our heights and arm spans, and to me, mathematics about ourselves is really, really important. And it's an example of using a hands-on approach. In maths, I think last time when I was talking, where I've just tried to circle hands-on, not very well. In maths, we often use the thing called manipulatives, but that basically means something that's a concrete thing that you can actually move around and play with. And sometimes that can be people, sometimes it can be newspaper articles, sometimes it can be something that we bought at the supermarket, it could be a container, can be dice and all that sort of stuff. So you'll see up on the right-hand side there, with a game called Multi-Digit that we played when I was in Tassie. I think it's a great way of having fun, but also in a practical way where people have concrete things that they can play with. So this is where I was hoping we'd get some of you to volunteer. So with your ideas and whether you've tried something since the workshops at the start of the year, whether there's something you've been doing for years that you always do that is about numeracy and mathematics that you'd be happy to share. So if people have got any things that they would like to share that have worked, either anything that you might have even tried. Did you play multi-digit with a group of students since we did it at the start of the year? So it would be nice for us to have some volunteers to have a discussion or to share what I notice some people are typing away, so maybe we'll have some ideas, but also if Hugh wants to join in, because I know Hugh knows everybody in Tassie.
Everybody, I've just unmuted the phone today.
But you might have had some feedback. I know after the workshops we had some feedback. I'm pretty certain somebody said they'd played multi-digit and that their learners had a great time playing multi-digit afterwards. So I don't know whether you've heard anybody else had feedback, Hugh, about what people have been doing since back in whenever it was.
We've had a bit of can you hear me, Dave?
Yep.
Yeah, I've learned how to unmute the phone. One of the things that we've found is that we get quite a few people coming in with a specific request. It may be they've been having trouble with their particular bill.
I have.
Particular invoice. Maybe they come to a workplace where there's a specific set of calculations or processes, mathematical processes they need to go through, and they're very focused on the particular thing that they want to do. And it's often difficult to move away from that.
Yeah.
In your views on it.
Yeah, I mean, so the question from Hugh, because a few people have said they didn't hear Hugh as clearly. Hugh was saying that what often happens is that a student will come in with a specific issue that they want to resolve, and it could be a specific workplace issue, it could be something from home, it might be interpreting the gas bill, but something specific. And I think that's always fine. It's often the best place to start is to use what your learners are coming to you with as an issue. And I think that that's a good start, and I think what we need to do is to then sort of say, or use that as a starting point to say, well, are there other areas of mathematics? There are other things that you are having problems with. Because often I think people, one, they're often apprehensive to say, I have got a problem. So if they're actually acknowledging that there's something that they want to overcome, then maybe that's a good starting point to have that discussion about, well, where else do you use mathematics? Are there other jobs at work that you're avoiding doing because you don't feel confident? Are there other things that you would like to understand related to the thing that you've brought in? So it's often a starting point. And often I guess it's in that diagnosis that that you find that in fact that particular instance they've brought in is indicative of bigger problems in mathematics, and that therefore can you use that as the starting point to say, well, what about if we also go and look at measurement, or we go and look at this, depending on what the context is that they're actually working in. So I don't know whether you want to comment on that, Hugh.
Yes, I mean it's the perennial problem, isn't it, that we have with all of our literacy and numeracy learners. You know, often they've got a specific goal in mind, and to be able to use that as the context for then building their interest in the broad range of things they potentially could learn is often the difficulty. And for some, it works. Specific strategies might work for some people, and they may not work for others. It's very much being in tune with the learner and knowing what potentially might work for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, one of the things I always say I've had a very fortunate, lucky career, but in that sense that when I started really focusing in on adult numeracy, when I was working at a TAFE, I moved over into the, I was dreadful name in those days, what we used to do, but still, it was called the Compensatory Education Department, but it was basically the Literacy and ACEL department, and then I was the token numeracy person. And but it was working with my literacy colleagues that taught me a lot of what I now know. But what I also did was that I then team taught with a literacy person, and it was actually doing that team teaching where we were calling the class probably just a literacy class because people didn't want to necessarily say that they had problems with maths. And so what we were able to do was use the same context, the same theme, the same topics, the same issues, and we just taught literacy and numeracy in parallel almost, and we just moved from one to the other because, to me, any context will have both literacy aspects and numeracy aspects, and if we can actually do that, we don't have to actually necessarily say to students, you're now just going to go and do the math, or you're now just going to do reading. And so if we integrate it, I think that's an opportunity to address a range of skill areas, including numeracy. So I think the more we can sort of say that, you know, numeracy almost is part of literacy, that, you know, we can often address some of those issues that are underpinning a whole range of skill gaps if that, you know, that people are facing. I mean, also just responding to Katrina and Simon. Was there somebody else? I'm just going back up. Yeah, so Simon obviously played with the 10-sided dice, and I think that, you know, I used to get into trouble because some of my numeracy classes were too noisy, so the literacy teacher next door would come and tell me to quieten down. But people were really surprised that a math class you could even have noise or fun, because everybody still thinks you should be sitting there working with a worksheet. And again, you know, when I heard about and used multi-digit when I was teaching, I mean, I was just gobsmacked about how many people like playing those sorts of games. And Katrina sort of talking about using the shopping catalogues, supermarket catalogues. I mean, it was just what I had always in my, you know, my folder, and I'd have different sorts of catalogues. I have the supermarket catalogues, but Myers catalogues, department store, any department store, small goods, you know, I mean, car catalogues. You can find a whole pile of catalogues which is just about money, and the people often will engage with money, and I think a lot of that stuff is really practical. I like Simon's comment about gambling because it's interesting, because I've actually done some other work in the school sector, and it's interesting even across Australia that some states won't actually allow gambling to be taught in schools, and I just think that's head in the sand stuff. I mean, if we actually teach about chance and gambling, we don't have to call it gambling if we don't want to, but, you know, if we don't actually teach our students about probability and chance, then why would they not gamble? Because, you know, if they don't have that knowledge, then they'll think that they've got this really big chance of, you know, winning when they buy a Tats Lotto ticket. So to me, I think it's a really good idea to come up, have those conversations that arise, I think, naturally out of playing a game like multi-digit. Is what's the chance of doing this? What's the chance of doing that? And if we actually address it, then maybe people won't get into so much debt. I mean, I'd really love some real research about the people who get into, you know, gambling debts to know what their literacy and numeracy skills are, because I just think there has to be a really strong correlation, but people don't seem to do that sort of research. And my natural instinct is that, you know, if you're getting into gambling difficulties, then I reckon there's a 99% chance that your numeracy math skills are really, really low. So, I think at the workshops I probably said that, as educators we often have, they're not ulterior motives, but we're actually in education and we're working in literacy and ESL because we actually think it makes a difference to people's lives. And so sometimes our decision to look at a particular context is because we think there's good messages in there. So I think it's interesting. And John's comment about tutors feeling uncomfortable, if you like, with maths. But I think if we can, also say that maths doesn't have to just be like maths was at school, then I think more people might get engaged with actually playing with maths, but teaching mathematics and see it as a natural teaching thing that can happen, but also that it can be interested in. People can be just interested in, if you like, the language and the way we use mathematics in our lives, and without having to do a lot of formal mathematics. And maybe you do that for a while, and then eventually say, oh well, why don't we all learn together how we can work with percentage calculations and so on and so forth? Because you can often have conversations, discussions, talk about the words, talk about how they're used, what they mean, without having to do the calculations. I mean, obviously, me with my math teacher's hat on, I'd say yes, but yes, let's now get on to the actual understanding of the mathematics and how it works. But I think sometimes we can tread softly, and then eventually students may say, oh yeah, well, it would be interesting to do this. Yeah. I'll just see if what's on my next slide. But if people can still put in their questions, or if you've got any other questions.
Yeah, no, Dave, I think we're going well. We're going well for time, and if there are any other questions, we can have them. But I think the issues you've raised are always pertinent, and they're ongoing. It's our area, and we need to do it better in a lot of cases. We have people who come in, and often it's difficult to make sure we meet their needs. And I think all the suggestions and all the strategies that you're describing are excellent, and have the opportunities through those strategies to engage people much more than we probably do.
Yeah, so I think, so the whole idea really of this series of workshops was to sort of build people's, confidence to one extent, to actually say, yes, I can do something about numeracy. And in some ways, I think the first workshops were about me saying, this isn't, you don't have to be maths people won't like me saying this, but you don't have to be a qualified maths teacher to actually address the maths issue. If you take that focus of numeracy is about teaching literacy, it's about teaching math, and it's about teaching language. And so therefore I think, there are lots of reasons why, we can deal with numeracy in that real sense in terms of people's lives, whether that be a study, or whether it's part of work, or whether it's part of just how they're coping as a family member, as a parent, or whatever. And I think that's an important message. And then, maybe that then opens doors up to say, oh shit, yes, sorry about my language. Let's now go off and do a formal maths course. Like, yes, maybe I do want to become work in electrotechnology, where I need to be at ACSF level 5, but then we can structure a course around that. But if we can actually build that bridge by saying numeracy isn't this thing that has to stand out by itself, it's just part of what we're doing in our literacy teaching. I think that's really a really important message. And I think what I see is the second workshop, and what we wanted to the webinar was to say, think about some of these questions I'm posing now, so that when I come down again, I can address some of those things. Obviously I've got a few things up my sleeve that I want to do, but this question about, have you got some challenges? So are there questions that people, and we'll get a record of all these questions that you're all typing up now. So what I also want to know, and one of the purposes of the webinars, is to find out what else we can do together. But I guess by this conversation, this reflection, it's about, think about what you want to achieve the next time I come down, and that's what we'll spend the day trying to do. And I can work with different groups addressing different issues. So if we've got people who really want to focus on working with second language learners, then we can do that. If we've got somebody who is really more into courses like, Simon's talking about, what's the maths involved in the forklift course. We can address some of that, and people can work in a small group to address some of those issues. So I think it's about thinking forward as to what else do we need. And I think we've got another webinar scheduled in August. So again, we'll come back again in August just to get more feedback from you guys, so that then when I come down in September, we can have some really focused time to work together. Because when people ever ask me what's the best thing about how I can do this well, I say work with your colleagues. I mean, it's about sharing your knowledge. Don't think that you're the only person facing up to this challenge, and learn from each other and work with each other. Like I say with students, I think as teachers, I think the more we can do that, the better.
Yeah, it's great. And probably now's a good time to talk about those dates in September when you're coming down. It'll be the 7th, coming down in the 7th, which is a Monday, in Hobart, and then the 8th, Dave will be working specifically on the Tuesday afternoon with the literacy coordinators in Link, and then on the Thursday off to Launceston, and then Friday Burnie.
Or is it Wednesday?
Sorry.
Wednesday,
yeah,
Launceston.
Wednesday Launceston,
That's right.
Thursday in Burnie.
Yeah.
And the context, as you were saying, Dave, for our specific session with literacy coordinators will be some of the projects the coordinators are working on, where accredited units are being used from training packages in short courses to specifically build people's skills in an area. But the numeracy content in some of those courses will be of most interest to our coordinators, I would think.
Yeah. So I think you're getting some questions about when do registrations open.
Well, we'll be doing those pretty soon. The next webinar thing will be coming up as well. Jen and I will be talking about registering for those workshops in the next couple of weeks, and we'll get details to everybody then.
Yeah, so maybe people should pencil the dates in so you don't miss out.
No, that's a good idea.
Yeah, and I mean, because we had a lot last time, didn't we? We had about 40 in both.
Yes, we did.
Hobart and Burnie, and 15 or 16 in Launceston. So they were great days. I had a ball, so I was pretty exhausted by the end of it. But I'm happy to work hard. I'm happy to work hard on numeracy. So
hopefully we'll be able to exhaust you again, Dave.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it. Yeah.
All right, I think that's probably about it. I just noticed a question from Susan Alexander, and she's just talking about what she's found up there.
Yeah. So this is the sort of thing, again, I think that, if we bring to the next session, and in each location we'll obviously have people with some similar interests, and my aim will be to get people to work together to actually try and, in a structured way, come up with some actual activities that maybe they can then take away and actually start using. So last time, I guess, hopefully I gave some activities, and obviously people have played multi-digit and things like that. But hopefully next time we can actually come up with something that's concrete. And then my idea out of all of that stuff, which I haven't talked to Hugh and Jen about, is to actually, for us to take it away, maybe me, and to actually document it and then send it back to everybody. So, the group in Hobart might come up with 6 different activities, and the group in Launceston with another 3, and the group in Burnie with another 5 or 6. But everybody will get a copy of everybody else's work, so that what we end up, building up is in fact a set of ideas and activities that everybody's contributed to, that can then be shared around Tasmania. So that's in my head about how I'll try and structure that next part of the next workshop.
Okay, that sounds great, Dave. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we wind the session up?
No, not really. I've probably got a couple of slides that I haven't done, but people can get access to all these materials later, and an audio recording. And I think Anna... and there are a couple of links here, so if people who didn't attend the first time, when you would be able to log back in later, I'm pretty certain Anna might be able to tell us, or you might know, you should be able to access these couple of links and download or get a copy of my handout, which has got a lot of resources and so listed on it, which is related to Lucy's last question. So you should be able to get something out of this webinar as well that's quite practical.
Okay. That's great. Thanks a lot, Dave. I'd also like to draw everybody's attention to the little survey that's just come up on the screen. If you'd fill that in, just take a couple of minutes to have a look at that prior to leaving. I'd like to thank especially Anna, who's been in the background and helping me through this, and Don McDowell also for their providing the use of the Redback conferencing system for these seminars through ACAL. Please take a bit of time to complete the survey, and if you've got any other questions for Dave or things that you'd like to have included in the next series of workshops that Dave will be coming down to, please send information to Jen or I, and we'll make sure that we get that to Dave and we can really nail the things that you're interested in. I suppose that's about it. On behalf of ACAL and 2610, I'd like to thank you all for giving up your time, probably your lunch hours to attend today. Thanks, Dave, again, as always. Very interesting.
My pleasure. Good.
And look forward to seeing you down here again soon.
I'm looking forward to it. And thank you, everybody, for listening to me today, and hope I'll meet you all in September.
That's great.
Cheers.
Okay.
Bye, folks. Bye-bye.
See you.